Welcome to Making Moves, a podcast presented by the Center for Sport and Social Justice at Cal State University, East Bay. This episode focuses on anti-trans culture in sport, featuring an interview with Travers. This conversation is co-hosted by Ange Sunier and Ariel Duffy. This is McKenna Duda, your podcast host. I'm a Cal State East Bay alum, former collegiate, now recreational runner, and I just recently earned my bachelor's degree in kinesiology. I operate within Orange County, California as a sports manager, plus I direct and write the scripts for this pod. So glad to be here again. Here, we'd like to serve our audience by educating and also inspiring y'all to feel empowered through sport and social justice. All athletes, sports fans, and social justice advocates are welcome. Let's be mindful and address a topic that came up within the first season of this pod: pronouns. While someone may identify as a cisgendered individual, one whose gender identity is the same as their sex assigned at birth, many other individuals identify as trans, non-binary, or gender fluid. For all individuals across all gender identities, accurately using one's pronoun is an important practice. A quick tip when it comes to pronouns is to not ask one to share right away, but to open by stating what pronouns you best identify with. For example, for my introduction, I would share that my name is McKenna, but I prefer to be called Mac. I use the pronouns she and her, and I am proud to serve this community as the director of this podcast, Making Moves. I encourage you to check out Season 1's 2 episodes on gender equity, as there is invaluable information on these 2 episodes. As well, pronouns are briefly touched upon within one of these episodes. I have taken with me from this episode this practice of how to share pronouns within my introductions. By using pronouns in an open and non-forceful way, I'm able to engage with others in a kind, inclusive, and respectful way. Anti-trans culture within sports must be addressed through demystifying myths and misunderstandings regarding the participation of trans women within competitions. Hormone levels, sex testing, forced surgeries, and many other misconceptions still remain as taboo and questionable subjects within sport. Through education and the acknowledgement of no data backing these hatred-persisting beliefs, we can work towards promoting inclusivity within the world of sports. In order to address these issues in the now, gender self-determination is a proposed solution. Though not perfect, it is an improvement. Let's note that in order to fully include all gender identifications, the system as a whole should be questioned and readdressed. Let us strive for progress.
Hello, everyone. Your new friend, Ariel Duffy here. I am currently studying kinesiology, the study of human movement at CSU East Bay. I'm a retired derby skater, longtime coach, trainer, and current park skater. I'm passionate about fighting inequality in all forms. I use the pronouns she and her. Not only is it an honor to take part in this discussion, but it is a privilege to be joined here today by a new co-host.
Hey, everyone. Thank you, Ariel. I'm your other new friend. My name is Ange, or Angelo Sunier. I use they, them pronouns. I'm also a kinesiology student here at Cal State East Bay. I'm really excited to be a part of this podcast and get into some great discussion about the intersectionality of sport. I've personally been a lover of sport since I was a kid, and today my main hobby is mountain biking. My goal career-wise is to work in physical therapy and ultimately increase accessibility in PT. So that's a little about me in a nutshell, and I'm looking forward to this interesting episode on anti-trans culture. I'll pass it back to Ariel to get us started.
Thank you. I would love to now introduce our incredible guest for this episode, Travers. Travers is a professor of sociology at Simon Fraser University. Their recent book, The Trans Generation: How Trans Kids and Their Parents Are Creating a Gender Revolution, situates trans kids in Canada and the US, white settler nations characterized by significant social inequality. And they were just appointed head coach of an 18U AAA baseball team in Canada. So let's begin by sharing where we're all joining from today and a beverage of choice if you have one. I'll start it out. I am joining here from beautiful Oakland, California, and I've been loving fresh ginger tea lately. I'll pass this one off to Ange.
Yum. Let's see. I'm also joining from Oakland, California. My favorite drink, probably have to say mate, the tea. I love a little caffeine boost that it gives me. And what about you, Travers?
I am joining you from Vancouver, Canada, the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Coquitlam nations. Probably this time of day, it's a green tea. If you asked me earlier in the morning, it would be a black tea.
That sounds about right.
All right, let's get right into it. Travers, can you tell us what does it mean to be trans?
Just in general, it means that you identify as a gender that is not consistent with the sex assigned to you at birth.
Right. And how can you, for us and for the listeners out there, can you make the distinction between sex and gender?
No, not really, because, for the long time, there was an assumption that sex relates to biological characteristics, which were understood in a binary form, whereas gender was understood to be like sort of a social identity. But one of the things that really important scientific studies have demonstrated is that deciding what sex somebody is a social decision. So there is no pure category. I suppose that sex does refer to embodiment more specifically, but there is no binary.
Great. Thank you for that. That's interesting.
Well said. In the United States, we're experiencing a backlash around trans participation in sports. There are several states considering the passing of a bill that excludes trans kids from sports participation. There are movements such as the UK Women's Place, or WPUK, who fight to restrict gendered spaces according to sex and reproductive organs. It seems that there are female cis athletes opposed to trans participation in women's athletics too. Why do you think people are skeptical about trans participation in sport?
Well, I mean, if you look at sport more broadly, it's a white supremacist and colonial heteropatriarchal project. One of its main purposes when modern sport emerged was to provide men with a space of resistance to the feminist organizing of the day. So sport has been a place that, has like modern sport was developed to consolidate male power. And, sport is a showcase for so-called sex difference that normalizes gender inequality more broadly. So, I mean, sport is a place where if you start raising questions about the fundamental difference between men and women or boys and girls, like the whole edifice crumbles. So what are you going to do when you find out that it doesn't fit? I mean, and, there have been controversies around sex testing for decades. And the leading scientists of the day always problematized the sex tests that, like the Olympic movement was using, et cetera, saying that this is not scientific. Like there is not like a scientific way to demarcate between only two sexes. So sport is like a really, really central battleground for either normalizing or resisting gender inequality. So it makes sense that the participation of trans athletes sort of threatens the foundation of sport. But, the real hatred and the cruel tone of these bans, particularly targeting trans girls and young trans women, there's a claim that they have to protect women's sport, they have to protect girls. But in reality, trans girls and women are not any threat at all to cis girls and women. So, it's not really about protecting girls and women, because if we were really interested in protecting girls and women, we'd be doing a lot of things differently.
That is quite true.
Very interesting. What would you say are some myths about trans people in participating in sport?
Well, I think that when we talk about any kind of controversy or conflict around trans people in sport, we're talking about trans women and trans girls. I call it I call it a testosterone panic. The assumption that trans girls and women, by virtue of being assigned male at birth, somehow have an athletic advantage that over cisgender girls and women that never goes away. The fact that there are more significant differences among people assigned female and among people assigned male, is beside the point. But, there's just this assumption that, boys are stronger than girls, men are always stronger than women, and that you can't change that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I really resent that myth that if a woman is too strong, too good at sport, well, she must be a man. There's really something interesting to that thinking, and that testosterone will make somebody better in every way possible. It's anti-trans. It's also very just anti-female.
Yeah, and I mean, there's the assumption that the difference in hormone levels among people assigned girls versus assigned boys isn't significant until puberty on average. And trans women, I mean, one of the requirements of participation in elite level sport has been to bring testosterone levels down to a certain norm, which is, very questionable to begin with. But, the idea that it doesn't matter, if you were assigned male at birth, you are always going to have an advantage, no matter, whether you've gone through puberty or not, or no matter whether you've, undergone testosterone suppression or not. It's just, there's just an assumption that however you were born, with the assumption that a doctor got to decide, what sex you were, that they're never wrong, and that this always is the most important thing when it comes to athletic participation.
I have a question on that for you. For someone who's not necessarily transphobic or anti-trans, but maybe misinformed on this issue, because I feel like there's such a misunderstanding of testosterone. There's not actual research to back that up, but that's just ingrained in our society right now. What would you say to those people that are thinking that right now?
Well, I think I would probably just explain how unbelievably complicated human sexual variation is. This notion of a binary category is, it's absolutely taken for granted. The ideology of the two-sex system, but it's an ideology, and it's based on Eurocentric norms about, gender difference. Indeed, one of the ways that European powers justified colonial dispossession and genocide was by claiming that the people that they were doing it to were not civilized. And one of the pieces of evidence that they used to prove that they were not civilized was, for example, egalitarian gender systems, or gender systems that were more complicated than, the heteropatriarchal model. So, I mean, I think that's really important to keep in mind. And so if you accept the fact that sexual dimorphism is a cultural norm and not a biological reality, then you realize, what do you do with sport? How do you organize sport when, there are overlaps in male-female performance, and it's really hard to say what confers unfair advantage. I mean, and what is considered to be a fair versus unfair advantage is a social decision. It's not a scientific one. It's not a biological decision. If you happen to have the genetics that make you 6'10" and you're assigned female at birth, you're going to be, have some advantages if you play basketball or volleyball, for example, as opposed to someone who ends up being 5'2"? Like, should people who are 6'10" be considered to have had an unfair advantage and have to undergo like leg shortening surgery? I don't know. Like, that seems so absurd, right? But, these are some of the things that we get to. I mean, Michael Phelps has massive hands and feet. And apparently he has Marfan syndrome, which does something that makes him even swim better. So it's like, what is considered? So I do think that once you go, oh, wow, it's all a social decision. And that this idea that we can categorize people cleanly and that we can control sport in such a way, I mean, it really becomes kind of mind blowing. And then you have to start thinking about sport like more critically, like, what does it do? It makes a lot of people a lot of money. It normalizes a lot of social inequalities. How could we reorganize it differently to be more inclusive and more constructive? So you're starting a conversation with someone that really shatters a lot of beliefs about the way that the world is organized and, what sport is for. So, it's a difficult conversation because it's very unsettling.
Yeah, I appreciate you addressing all the nuances and just complexity there. It's like you said, it's just mind blowing. And yeah, thank you for that.
And modern sport, as we know it, is a particular historical and social formation. No more, no less. It's not like some, institution that is so sacred and so natural that we can't rethink it.
Well said. How are different organizations, the NCAA and also organizations for different sports, such as like track and field or mountain biking, addressing trans participation in sports right now?
Well, things are changing like right now so radically, so quickly that I'm sure I'm missing something. Like, I'm not up to date on what's been happening in mountain biking. But I do know that, there are long stories behind this. I mean, there have been anti-trans initiatives all along. It's something that the Christian right and this strange sort of partnership with so-called gender critical feminists have been advocating, this particular attack on trans women and girls. But I mean, there's the whole sex testing controversy and the lack of evidence to support female eligibility. You have female eligibility policies at the highest levels of sport. I'm thinking of the International Olympic Committee, the International Amateur Athletics Federation, formerly now World Athletics. They, in a lot of ways, been leaders in policy. So they had female eligibility policies that have been based on different so-called tests over the years. Each one at the time has been disavowed by leading scientists in the field as unscientific and very, very harmful. You've had court cases. And, one of the things that has become really clear is there really is no basis for developing a hard and fast line between who should be eligible for competing in female events and who shouldn't. So I think the IOC was trying to find that line, and instead, it seems lately they've offloaded it to the individual athletic federations. And the NCAA has been an organization that had a fairly progressive trans inclusive policy when they announced it in 2011. And actually, the IOC followed them. But what has happened, which has been really alarming, is that the IOC very, very recently, like in the last month, the IOC changed its policy in November to offload it to individual sport federations, saying, well, it depends on the sport, like, is it a gender affected sport, to use the UK women in sport language, or is it skill based? And the NCAA, like in the last month, has changed its policy. And the swimmer, Leah Thomas, am I right? Leah Thomas. It's about that. She's winning. You can't win. Like, if you're a trans woman or a trans girl, it's fine if you compete for some people, but once you start winning, then obviously there's a problem, which is really unfortunate. But it does seem like that the NCAA has caved to transphobic pressure around Leah Thomas's success, as well as, been influenced by the changes at the elite levels of sport policy by the IOC, et cetera, that, now they're going to make it sport dependent. And this opens a whole Pandora's box of insanity. Each sport is going to determine for itself something that, the premier organizations in the world with no shortage of money and resources have been unable to do. So, now individual sports are going to do it. So you're going to get these unbelievably transphobic pockets here, probably some more progressive environments in other sport. And it's one thing that it does do, which I think is helpful, is it reveals how it is really endlessly political. But for the impact on trans athletes is absolutely brutal. Trans girls and young women in particular, who have been following, for example, in college sport, in collegiate sport, Leah Thomas has been following the rules, and all of a sudden, sorry, that's not good enough. When I interviewed trans kids and trans young people, a lot of them just assumed that they could never compete in sport at the time. And so since that time, I think, my interviews were between about, 2015 and or whatever, 2011 and 2017. And there've been these progressive changes since, but now it's going back. And these horrible attacks on trans girls and trans young women in particular, I think that, there are some trans girls and trans women who, they're tough enough to be a groundbreaker and to deal with that kind of, but, the majority of trans girls and young trans women are just going to go, no, this is just too terrifying. I'm not going to do this. And that to me is so awful. And it sends such an awful message. I'm really, really deeply alarmed at the, the way in which trans girls and trans young women in high school and collegiate sports have been targeted by these organizations for such hatred. It's so awful. It reminds me of the Black students in Little Rock integrating, being spat on by people. It's the same kind of deep-seated hatred that is so awful. And I wonder, how can we surround them with the kind of community that makes this bearable? I don't know.
Yeah, that's a lot to just respond to. And like you said, I feel like there's been, I don't know if I could say a lot, but in some ways, a lot of progress. And then in other ways, so much backlash and regression. And it's just, yeah, it's sometimes I feel hopeful and sometimes I feel just heartbroken. And, yeah, it's kind of hard to know, I guess, what's next. But I know that's kind of how history works, a back and forth, One thing I did want to say about the NCAA, I just was reading about it, I think either yesterday or today even, they did make a decision, at least for this coming term, that Leah Thomas can compete.
Oh, good.
And yeah, so that's a huge win. But I didn't understand quite, you were touching on the fact that the IOC is kind of passing off the rules or the decision making to the people below, which I didn't quite understand that. And now you're helping it make sense, because I guess the NCAA is was under pressure to adopt the USA swimming procedures, which says that trans women have to be on estrogen for 36 months. And Leah Thomas would have been disqualified because she's only been on HRT for 33 instead of 36 months, which is so completely, first of all, it's ridiculous that there is, even a regulation around that. But just the fact that they're going to ruin someone's life, college career, college athletic career for 3 months of a rule that doesn't even make sense, But on the bright side, at least she does get to compete right now. And I feel like there is some movement towards that, like support and the loosening of these, like the measurement rules, the very white way of like measuring things by number and having to like follow that. Which leads it, we've already touched on a lot of things about the International Olympic Committee, but I kind of want to delve into that a little bit more because, like you said, just in November of 2021 last year, they made some changes where they, in some ways, like loosened up their policies. So they no longer have a testosterone level limit for trans women athletes. But can you go deeper into like what is your opinion on these new guidelines, and also about they had issued an apology for past harm? Curious what your thoughts are on the apology and the new guidelines.
Well, it like in a nutshell, it's like you can't win. So you had these things like, I think that a lot of people became aware when Caster Semenya was targeted in 2009 for, female eligibility. They'd stopped doing sex testing for all women athletes in, I think, 2004 or 2001 or 1999. I'm not sure, but sometime, but they were still doing it selectively. So Caster Semenya and, not accidentally, other Black and brown women from the global South were specifically targeted for sex testing. And Dutee Chand in 2015 was a South Asian runner who brought a case to the Court of Arbitration for Sport saying that you have no evidence that my naturally higher than so-called normal for a woman testosterone level gives me an unfair advantage. Well, she won. And then the IAAF produced new evidence to support it. And so the CAS said, okay, that's fine. But then recently, which is what has been said all along, that evidence was completely flawed. Like it doesn't exist. I mean, you have like Jordan Young and Carcazes who have been publishing about female eligibility policies and the lack of scientific evidence about testosterone. They've been saying this all along, and they were in Chan's corner. They were involved in this, pointing out the evidence just isn't solid. So you finally get to the point where the IOC is going, you're right. We've never had any evidence. You're right. The science just isn't there. And we've forced these women to have unnecessary surgeries that will have long-term health consequences, really negative health consequences. And we're really, really sorry we've done it. You're right. But instead of coming up with something more inclusive, they're saying we're offloading it to the individual sports to decide whether or not being a woman with hyperandrogyny, for example, or being a trans woman gives you an unfair advantage. So it's like the IOC was so problematic. They finally go, oh my God, we're so problematic. But then they don't actually take responsibility by developing more appropriate policy. Instead, they say, it's up to the individual sport. So even when you win, sometimes it feels like you lose. Like I can imagine that Jordan Young, I'd love to hear what they have to say, because they are the, probably the most important speakers, in this debate. They know the most. I would love to hear what they would have to say, but instead of it being a victory, to me, it feels like yet another way to perpetuate myths about female inferiority and the threat posed by trans women and girls.
That makes sense. And I also got the impression reading the IOC's regulations that they were saying, we're sorry, but pass. Not really taking the actions necessary and leaving it to, different international organizations, which I'm sure some will do the right thing here soon, and some will probably take their time.
Well, look at World Rugby. I mean, World Rugby was the first domino to fall when it said that trans women cannot compete because, this is a sport where size and strength really matters. And, the assumption that all trans women are bigger and stronger than all cis women and therefore a threat. I mean, like World Rugby in a lot of cases sort of, was the first organization. So I would, I think this is incredibly troubling.
I was also just interested to hear that the IOC had done that offloading, as you're saying. And I guess I'm curious if you have any thoughts of like, if they were going to propose a better solution other than just offloading the regulations. I'm curious what you would suggest. And one question kind of like that I would like to weave into that is on the topic of race. I know that a lot of your work focuses on race and colonialism and like that intersectionality in so many ways. But here we're talking specifically about sport. And you'd mentioned that, pretty much, I mean, I don't know if there's a percentage, but a high percentage of the women that are being targeted either as like intersex or trans women targeted. I know the 2 teenagers who ran track in Connecticut. One of them, they both were anyway. They're both Black young women, both targeted in this very white state. Like you said, Caster Semenya, Duchi Chand, and I feel like the list goes on. Even last July in the summer, there was 2 teens from, I think it was Namibia, that were disqualified from the 400 meter. So what would you say or recommend? What would be like something that would be a just policy for trans athletes? And then also speaking to the racial aspect of like how transgender sport kind of meet.
Well, I'm going to, for me, it's very simple, but then everything starts to unravel. It would be gender self-determination. That's it. But then, what do you do with non-binary athletes? Well, my position would be that non-binary athletes should compete in whatever category feels like more appropriate, while at this, but the thing, it also speaks to the need to like undo the sex segregated foundation of modern sport. And what do we replace it with? And you can't separate it from, the economic inequality and the capitalist foundations of sport, because sometimes winning really makes a difference to somebody's socioeconomic security. Sometimes it doesn't. Like, if you're a US or a Canadian athlete in a sport that doesn't have a lucrative professional league, sometimes I think you actually end up losing more earning power if you're middle class anyway than you would, because, it's not exactly rewarding. But for some people, it's the only way they're going to go to college or university. It's really, really difficult. And I don't think you can separate those things. But what I would say is, gender self-determination, and have each category have trans inclusive boundaries. I mean, in other work, I've argued that sex segregation is like incredibly problematic, that it needs to be eliminated. But I wouldn't eliminate girl and women only spaces as long as they had trans inclusive boundaries, like sort of as a provisional category. Because right now, if you just eliminated sex segregation, you would expose girls and women to like even more misogyny than they already experience. So, but yeah, for sure, gender self-determination. But we also have to look at the way in which, sport is connected to unequal distribution of material and cultural resources too. And it's really problematic. I mean, if everybody has their basic needs met, like say, if everybody got a guaranteed annual income that allowed people to live like at a level where dignity was possible and some autonomy and choices, and, then sport wouldn't be quite as loaded, like if you're going to be okay, no matter what, like, okay, maybe I won't, be able to fly all over the world and, wear like, 300 thread count cotton shirts or whatever. Like maybe I won't be able to do that, but I'm going to, have a comfortable place to live and a decent diet. I'm going to get adequate health care, and I'm going to, having an opportunity to build connections with people that are, really rewarding. It's like, but the thing is that our whole society, like in both Canada and the United States, is predicated on the fact that, a good chunk of the population is going to be denied those basic things. So there is a anxiety and desperation, and sport is caught up in that. And so you can't separate it. Like it's not possible to separate it.
That's what I love about, reading some of your work or watching some of your talks is your focus on intersectionality and obvious, how do I say this nicely, suspicion of capitalism and just how that infects everything else from sport to our culture to, just how we treat more vulnerable people in our society.
And even the model of sport where, you have one winner, winners and losers. It's like, I'm a really competitive person and I enjoy competing, but, it's sport is used to normalize social inequality and to normalize competition rather than community. So like, it's part of a very like dehumanizing, unhealthy and, environmentally unsustainable like approach to life. So, you can't look at it on its own. But in the immediate term, absolutely, my policy would be gender self-determination. If you identify as a girl, you're a girl.
I like that, the gender self-determination. That's awesome.
Yeah. And it's like, think about what you would have to do to make that possible for children. Think about the space you would have to create around them. I mean, like I experienced my own, gender hell when I was a kid. But with my own children, I tried so hard to hold back the people that wanted to tell them who they were, what they liked, who they liked, what they wanted to do in terms of their gender. And it was, I couldn't do it. Like I tried so hard. I used all my resources to try to create that space around them, and I couldn't do it. And really nice people were doing it. Not just the stereotypes of the people that, stormed the Capitol, like really nice people who I actually like. And that makes it really hard, but it's so insidious.
Yeah, thank you for your words on that. We're going to hop around briefly before Angel lead us into our last question, but I just wanted to ask a little about your latest book, writing about the transgender community and being a transgender activist and an advocate for trans kids. Can you speak to the title of your book, The Trans Generation, How Trans Kids and Their Parents Are Creating a Gender Revolution? I'm curious about why you use the phrase gender revolution to define the book.
I think it was possibly, marketing. I think I had a great editor, and I think, there is a gender revolution. And one of the arguments that I make in my book is that much of this revolution, for sure, like trans people ourselves and our activism and social movements have been so important. But with regard to the spaces that have opened up for trans children, it's white, middle, and upper class moms who are like at least, who are gender conforming, who can go and do work in the institutions where children circulate that nobody else can do. Like, and in a lot of ways, those were, that was a main audience of my book, was like, you're in there doing this work. So do it for all trans kids. Do it for the trans kids who are hungry. Do it for the trans kids who don't have secure housing. Do it for the trans kids who are autistic or have learning disabilities. Don't just do it for the privileged trans kids that are in your family. Because literally, like what white, middle, and upper class professional moms can do when they like take on institutions is unbelievable. If they're not threatening.
Very true. Yeah. What white women power for what it's worth.
Use it for good. Use your power. Like, I think like as a white person myself, how can I use my white privilege to destabilize my white privilege? Like, and I'm sure that there are a lot of ways where I use my white privilege to stabilize my white privilege where I'm unaware, but how can I learn how to, to use my unearned privilege to change the system where some of us have unearned privilege?
Oh yeah, I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, I think that's awesome that you're just advocating for people who have the power and the time, the comfort, and the ability to make the change, to really step up and do it. I think that's awesome. I picked up your book. Once I found out we were doing this talk, I ordered the copy and just really amazed with just the way that you tie everything together. And I think it's so cool that you did the book focusing on children too. I think that's like such an interesting and unique perspective, and like the way you tell stories, and just really rich. So definitely put a plug for anyone out there listening to pick up a copy of the book. Is really awesome.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, seriously. I had a question off of that before we wrap up. What, I guess, as far as the title of your book goes, creating this gender revolution, which I think is true and really awesome that is happening right now. I do hear a lot of people say, especially kind of on the, anti-trans end, like, oh, this is transness is a new, quote unquote, a new thing. And while I do believe there's like new space for trans kids to come out and actually be trans, visibly, and live as their authentic self because there's more support, I believe it's by no means a new thing. How do you respond to that? Or like, do you have any kind of like little tidbits of history that you could, wisdom drops that you could put out for the audience?
Well, I always refer them to Jules Gill-Peterson's The Histories of the Transgender Child, where she documents the fact that, trans kids have always existed. But also, I think one of my key points will be to quote educational scholar Mark Helen, who argues that the majority of trans kids are invisible because they don't feel it's safe to show themselves. But, I tell people, trans children. If you work with children, if you spent time with children, you have interacted with trans kids, but they haven't been in a safe environment to show themselves. But if you start creating space, not by saying, hey, if any kid is trans, that's fine. But if you start like talking about gender as a spectrum and not talking about what boys are like or girls are like, and you don't organize children according to gender category, and you create lots of models, and, you have books around about different kinds of people, then you're going to find that, those trans kids are going to start to show themselves because they feel like, it isn't, I mean, when I was a kid, oh my God, like I never would have ever believed that if you told me that same-sex marriage would happen, or that I could be an openly queer and trans baseball coach for kids. Never, but you start to see the effect of social change, which is like generation after generation of activism and work. You do see it. But also we can't minimize what's happening right now, which is the activism on the right, which is designed to drive us back underground. And it's going to succeed to an extent. Like this is a huge fight, that they've been waging all along in different ways. And, with some of the success of trans social movements and supporters, like they're trying to win. And what they want is a biblical state. And that is not what we want. A white supremacist biblical state. That is not what we want, but it's what they want.
If they're fighting, we need to fight back. I agree with that.
Yeah, and they're playing the long game, and we have to do that too. It's like I talked with a doctor in one of the states where the law was passed that banned the access of trans kids to gender affirming care, and she was so upset about it. And I said, okay, this is awful, but just the fact that you have publicly spoken out that you believe trans kids are real and that they deserve access to care, like some kid heard it, it's like you've got to not feel like your actions are wasted. Even when you don't win, you still have a presence, And I've talked to young queer students, queer and trans students, and allies that, if their school board policy to end homophobia and fails, like they really worry about it. I said, yeah, but think about all the students who saw you out here. Like you'll never know what impact you had, but they saw you, and because I didn't even have that growing up. So you have to have this vision that you don't win what you want to win, but even having showing your visible support for people, like it's not wasted.
Thank you for that little bit of hope. I think, yeah, it's cool. Not a little bit. Like, I know there's hope that we've been talking about during this conversation, but there is also just a lot of heavy and really intense backlash going on right now. So it is good to hear some of the positives. And like you said, even just, some decades ago that you didn't have the examples in our society, or even the ability to imagine same-sex marriage could be a possibility. And, I feel grateful. Growing up in my lifetime, I didn't see same-sex marriage until, what was that, even in the last 10 years, So it's definitely encouraging to know that things are changing, if slowly.
Yeah, but we also can't assume that, we're on this inevitable trajectory of progress. Like, life is messy. There's conflict over the distribution of resources. Like, we're in it. Wherever we are, we're in it. And it's just, it's like, and it's very, very easy to feel so down because the kind of toxic stuff that, like, I remember when Trump was elected and the way I felt, like, and when Biden was elected, even though, oh my God, it's so problematic. Like, does it really matter who the president of the United States is? But I did feel a tiny bit better, but it makes sense to be very afraid of, the forces of evil that are working away at all our lives, really. But, we resist. That's what we do.
Yes, I appreciate that. And on that note of activism, for our last question to wrap up, you just spoke to some resources in general, on the history of transness and trans children. What would you suggest to the audience as some resources for people who want to advocate for the trans athlete? Whether you're a fan of sport or an athlete yourself, like how can you be an ally and an advocate to trans athletes?
I think a really good website and organization for me to plug is Athlete Ally. They are right out there leading the fight on behalf of trans athletes. There's also outsports.com. That's another organization, but Athlete Ally is an organization. I'm one of the affiliated scholars. It's a key organization that is doing this, both academic and activist work to support trans athletes. So that's a good place to start. But also, find out who it is that makes decisions about these things in your city, in your state, at your community center. And according to your own capacity, find ways to be one of those people that makes a difference in a room. Like, if people in a room are making a decision that's really negative, can you get in that room? Can you get in that room without doing harm to yourself? Do you have the resources and the resilience to be one of those people that gets into that room? Like, I am now a AAA baseball coach, and I can't do anything about the fact that, there's only one young woman who's trying out for that team. I do think that my presence there, I can help contribute to an environment where more will stick with the sport because they drop out a lot. But, one thing I can guarantee is that young woman is going to get a fair trial. She's going to. And there have always been male coaches that would do that. But, being in that position, I can guarantee she will get a fair tryout. She won't make the team because she's a woman, and she won't not make the team, but she will get a fair tryout. But I can't make the feeling that she's unusual and alone go away.
Great. Thank you for the resources there. And we'll definitely plug those in the show notes for people to check out. And I just want to say, wow, thank you so much for your time today. I really enjoyed the conversation, and it's been a pleasure getting to hear your expertise and just, your years of research in the field and personal experience with transgender awareness. I just am really honored to speak to you.
Thank you.
This podcast was brought to you by the Center for Sport and Social Justice at Cal State University East Bay. It was produced by McKenna Duda, Kim Muzi, Nikhil Kernar, and Kushal Sheshadri. The music is by Marby Miller. A big thank you to the Center for Sport and Social Justice co-directors Dr. Matthew Atencio and Dr. Missy Wright for their support. Funding for Making Moves was provided by Cal State University East Bay and the Center for Sport and Social Justice. Make sure to catch all 6 episodes of Making Moves, streaming now on SoundCloud, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts.